Good evening, everybody, and welcome to our annual Celebrating Philanthropy event. My name is Anil Varghese, and I'm the Graduate Supervisor of the Master of Philanthropy and Nonprofit Leadership Program in Carleton University School of Public Policy and Administration. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that Carleton University is situated on the traditional and unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe Nation. As settlers, immigrants, and visitors, we honor and respect the many indigenous peoples of this land and are grateful for the opportunity to live, learn, and work here. June is the National Indigenous History Month in Canada, a time to learn about and reflect on the histories, cultures, and experiences of First Nations, Inuit, and the Métis peoples. As an academic community, we are committed to advancing reconciliation, engaging respectfully with Indigenous communities, and ensuring that Indigenous knowledge and perspectives inform our teaching, learning, and research. As many of you know, we hold this annual event in conjunction with our Summer Institute when we welcome our students to campus for 2 weeks of intensive in-person learning. We are delighted to welcome our newest Master's and Graduate Diploma cohort, our 14th cohort, as well as the 13th cohort returning for their second Summer Institute. They come from across Canada and beyond, bringing a rich diversity of experiences, perspectives, and professional backgrounds. This evening also marks an exciting milestone for the program and for the sector. Last year at this event, we announced the creation of Canada's first research chair in philanthropy. After an extensive search, we have now found a person to fill that position, Dr. Jamie Levin-Daniel. Jamie, are you here? Okay, over here. Dr. Daniel is an internationally recognized scholar on nonprofit management. She joins us from New York University and previously taught for 8 years at Indiana University with a cross-appointment at the Lilly Family School of Philanthropy. Her research focuses on nonprofit acquisition, service delivery, and power, with a focus on equity and justice. So please join me in warmly welcoming Canada's first research chair in philanthropy, Dr. James Levin-Daniel. As some of you know, this chair position is a direct result of the success and growth of the MPNL program and the generosity of a remarkable group of donors from across Canada who shared our vision for strengthening the scholarship and practice in this sector. We are deeply grateful for their support and commitment, and we hope the chair will advance research, training, and capacity building in the sector for many years to come. I'm also pleased to announce another important development, the official launch of the MPNL Alumni Chapter. Earlier today, we formally inaugurated the chapter at our alumni reception. Affiliated with Carleton University Alumni Association, it will serve as a network of graduates of MPNL program and help strengthen the connections across our growing alumni community. An initial executive committee has been established, and we will seek alumni input on future programming and governance. I'd like to thank Rebecca Murray, who has agreed to serve as the inaugural president. Rebecca, are you here? Yes. And along with Christiane Robillard and Joe Bonner as founding executive members. If you are an MPNL alumni, please stay tuned for future updates and opportunities to get involved. We are also honored to be joined this evening by many distinguished guests, donors, supporters, faculty, and members of the Advisory Council whose generosity, expertise, and commitment have been instrumental in the program's success. A special thanks to our Advisory Council members who are really the network that helps the program build external relationship, and every summer the Advisory Council members take time out of their busy schedules to attend the Summer Institute. So thank you to all of you. I'd like to thank also the core faculty who teach in the program, Joanny Tremblay-Bois, Nathan Grassi, and Paloma Rago for their outstanding teaching and scholarship, as well as our staff, Anna Riethman, our program administrator, and Derek Rumbold-Deluche from Advancement for their invaluable support in organizing this year's Summer Institute and events. Each year, this event explores a theme of particular timely importance. This year, the theme is democracy and philanthropy. We have assembled an outstanding panel of scholars and practitioners to explore this timely topic. As always, our goal is to bridge research and practice, strengthen sector capacity, and contribute to the development of effective policy. It's now my pleasure to invite Dr. Susan Phillips to the podium. Susan needs little introduction. She's the founder and former graduate supervisor of the MPNL program, Professor Emerita in Carleton University School of Public Policy and Administration, and one of Canada's leading scholars of public policy and the nonprofit sector. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Susan Phillips, who will introduce the panelists and moderate this event.
Thank you, Anil, and welcome. The topic of philanthropy and democracy is important, and it couldn't be more timely. As we look south and internationally, democracy is in some peril. In Canada, concerns over closing civic space and civil dialogue are heard on a regular basis. Declining civic engagement is associated with declining giving and volunteering and a loss of a sense of belonging in community. And once you lose it, it's not that easy to get it back by any means. Vibrant, inclusive communities are part of building the innovation economy, albeit often overlooked in policy. And it's timely because funders, and foundations in particular, are starting to come together in Canada with affinity networks related to democracy. And many of them are still, as I understand it, early stages, fairly early stages in that journey and looking for guidance that we're going to offer them tonight. So philanthropy is part of a healthy democracy. And we ask tonight, how? What can philanthropy do to promote democracy and vice versa? And our panelists, as Anil suggested, bridges academe, bridges research and practice. We're first joined by Dr. William Cross, who is professor in the Department of Political Science here at Carleton, where he studies Canadian and comparative political institutions with an emphasis on the connections between civil society and political parties and legislatures. Bill's recent work has explored the relationship between party organization and gender, as well as sports and politics. And I think there's a book in the works on that. Professor Cross has won many awards, both internal and external, for his research, including a Lifetime Achievement Award for the Canadian Politics section of the American Political Science Association. And Bill also recently completed the Diploma in Philanthropy and Nonprofit Leadership. And I have to say, it was terrifying to have him in the classroom, but a valuable asset. Sabreena Delhon is the CEO of the Sabreena Centre for Democracy, Canada's leading nonpartisan organization focused on strengthening and protecting Canadian democracy. For over a decade, she's directed multi-stakeholder research and public engagement initiatives that have had an important impact across justice, across the academic and nonprofit sectors. Sabreena has appeared as an expert witness on parliamentary committees, on matters related to political participation, and frequently provides commentary on democratic engagement for various media outlets. And she hosts the Sabreena Centre's podcasts, Humans of the House and Group Chat. And watch for her upcoming article in The Philanthropist. Amanda Munday is the Executive Director of New Majority, a national nonpartisan nonprofit advancing youth, civic engagement, and voter turnout among Canadians under 30. She's also the founder of Workaround, an innovative co-working and childcare center in Toronto, and a TEDx Toronto speaker advocating for universal childcare, mental health, and equity. Amanda's a best-selling author whose work has appeared in the Globe and Mail, Forbes, Fast Company, among many others. She's a queer parent of 2 and a lifelong advocate for inclusive policy, social innovation, and impact. Welcome. And Holly Bair-Marshall, after 10 years in the philanthropic sector with the NAC, the National Arts Centre, Holly founded Third Wave Philanthropy, where she partners with nonprofits and individuals to maximize their impact through strategic fundraising and philanthropic consulting. Holly's guided nonprofits in developing strong fundraising programs, from annual giving to major gifts to corporate events, and supports individual philanthropists in aligning their giving with purpose and vision, and in particular to funding those who aren't the usual suspects. She's a member of the Black Canadian Fundraisers Collective and president-elect of AFP Ottawa, and she's an MPNL alum. To those of you who are about to be alum, you will never escape us. You will keep coming back for more and more. So our format is each speaker will present for about 8 or 9 minutes. I will be brutal in the timing. We'll have a moderated conversation among us. We'll take some questions from you, and then we have a moment or two for pithy takeaways from each of them. But to set the stage, I want to ask you each a question with a sort of 1-minute response. What is your main concern about democracy and its relationship with philanthropy? Briefly, your one-liner, Bill.
Brief. Well, in my remarks, I'm going to raise some concerns I have regarding the relationship between civil society organizations and government generally, and what I think may be their over-reliance on governmental support, and particularly what this means in the growing sphere of organizations working in the area of building democratic resilience. And I also want to suggest that members of the sector need to look internally and examine their own practices in terms of whether they're operating in ways that help to develop citizens with the skills and perspectives required for a strong democracy built from the community up.
Good. Sabreena.
So in 2007, when the Samara Centre's co-founders, Michael McMillan and Alison Lote, were getting going with the idea for this center, there was a lot of skepticism. The reaction they often got was, democracy, that's not a problem in Canada. And now, today, we're in a moment where many are very fearful about what the future of our democracy holds. And there's a public awakening that we've been complacent about protecting our democratic resilience. And we're paying the price for that with our social cohesion and our national security. So my concern about democracy in relation to philanthropy right now is how we all respond to this challenging moment and how we leverage it so that we're not just settling for the democracy we can get, but are instead ambitiously setting the course for the democracy that we want.
Amanda.
So I'm most concerned about the tension between capitalism and its power-driven forces and the participatory public voice priority of a healthy democracy, and specifically that winners and losers model of capitalism, which is not equality or about equal voices. And so what I'm bringing tonight is a lens on how philanthropy has historically replicated this model by design and what we should do about it.
Holly.
Yeah, it's a big question, and what comes to mind for me is really what I can only describe as the productive tension between democracy and philanthropy, and how they're fundamentally pretty misaligned values-wise, right? We have democracy, simply one person, one vote, and philanthropy, which concentrates power, might be for the good of the many, but certainly is decided by the few. So I'm curious about that, and putting on my fundraiser hat, I'm curious about how we get more people involved and excited about democracy as a lens for our cases for support, because a lot of organizations are doing democratic work. It's just not framed like that. And I think now is the time when maybe we should be framing it like that and unlock some philanthropic dollars.
So let's dig into that more. Bill, you promised you might be a little bit controversial, so please do so.
Thank you, Susan. Well, I want to begin consideration of this subject with acknowledgement that democracy is more than electoral and legislative politics. It is not just, or perhaps even primarily, about what happens in Ottawa or Victoria or Quebec City. The healthy and robust practice of democracy has at its foundation a strong community-based democratic infrastructure. As Tocqueville observed long ago, observed in the American case, and consistent with what political theorist Benjamin Barber calls strong democracy, citizens who participate and who practice associational decision-making across an array of activities and engage with their fellow community members in inclusive, participatory, and pluralistic associations are better equipped to form the necessary infrastructure for a robust democratic community. So I think when we consider the role of the nonprofit sector in preserving and enhancing our democracy, it's important to consider more than how they might influence through critique and watchdog type activity and in suggesting reforms of the workings of our formal political institutions. These are important activities, but by themselves are insufficient if not undergirded by a citizenry imbued with democratic competencies. And I also, in sort of setting the table, want to suggest that the relationship between philanthropy and democracy is, of course, a rather complex one. In a sense, the philanthropic exercise is inherently undemocratic in a country like Canada, where a generous tax credit for charitable donations results in a redirection of billions of dollars each year away from the public purse and thus away from the spending priorities of our democratically elected governments. This is true, of course, at both the provincial and federal levels. Coupled with this are substantial amounts of private charitable donations and diverted tax funds held in the endowments of philanthropic organizations and donor-advised funds. Recent estimates are that as much as $14 billion may now be held in abeyance in DAFs alone. Thus, these funds, supported by the public purse, that are not made available for increasing social, environmental, and other needs of the citizenry. And of course, much of this results from what I believe to be a relatively low disbursement quota that allows for the husbanding of these funds. Given the substantial amount of funds, both public and private in their genesis, within the spending discretion of philanthropic organizations, democratic concerns have to focus on their decision-making processes. Who makes these decisions? Are decision-making groups representative of the diversity of the Canadian population? Do they in any way foster democratic virtues of inclusiveness, deliberation, and participatory decision-making? Are groups that are marginalized from the formal democratic practice, Indigenous, racialized, young Canadians, invited to participate in philanthropic decision-making in meaningful ways? In other words, through their own structures and practices, does the sector promote the kind of citizenry that Barber and Tocqueville would argue are necessary to support a strong democracy? There is recent increased attention being paid to the need for nonprofit groups to play a role in safeguarding our democracy, as Susan mentioned. And there are a considerable number of organizations working at least tangentially in this sphere. The recent report of the Canadian Democracy Coalition identifies well over 100 such organizations. I think others on the panel may speak directly to this, so I won't, except to make one point. That is the importance that this project not be a partisan exercise. By that, I don't mean affiliation with any particular political party, but rather being a project of the progressive left. In its report, the coalition notes that only 2 of the 58 groups from the sector that were included in their study brought explicitly conservative, and that's small c conservative, perspectives, and that both of these groups raised important, substantive, democratic concerns that the rest of the sample had largely ignored. To quote the report, "The sector's failure is not that it holds progressive values, it is that it has not extended invitations to people who share its commitment to democratic institutions, but not its policy preferences," unquote. To be successful in efforts to strengthen our democracy and prevent democratic backsliding, I think it's imperative that initiatives include a diversity of voices in terms of public policy perspective. My final point concerns the relationship between organizations in the nonprofit sector engaged in democracy-enhancing work and government itself. I want to stake out a position that I know will be somewhat controversial and at odds with the views of at least some of my fellow panelists. There is currently a push from many groups working in the democracy-reliant sphere for government to fund a so-called democracy endowment of up to $200 million. And this proposal has been lauded by many in the sector. I want to raise some reservations I have about this. To my mind, it supports a conception of democracy as a good provided by government to its citizens. In a sense, this is like a public utility. Democracy is a widely shared good that benefits all and thus is worthy of government support and regulation. But I come back to the notion that democracy is formed in and out of civil society. Democratic government exists only when there is a strong and independent civil society. To make democratic resilience efforts dependent on governmental funding also makes them subject to the potentially changing winds and preferences and whims of government. Some have pointed to the U.S. National Endowment for Democracy as an exemplar of government support for the strengthening of democratic infrastructure. But as we are witnessing, the result of this reliance on government, the result of this reliance on government as funding has been jeopardized and the organization is not in the good graces of the current administration, an administration which has announced plans and taken steps towards stopping funding of NGOs that it believes undermines its view of the national interest. Charitable organizations in Canada are already significantly dependent on governmental contributions. In 2023, the government continued to be the main source of revenue for charities, making up almost 2/3 of all revenue. To make this the case for efforts at strengthening democratic process suggests to me seeing democracy as a good, again, provided by government to its citizens. Rather, these efforts, in my view, should be independent from government and its purse. For the same reason, I've long expressed reservation regarding high levels of public funding for our political parties. I started with Tocqueville, so I'll finish with him as well. I think his concern about the government's domestication of nonprofits would no doubt increase after learning how many of them rely on public funding from different levels of government, and this would be compounded for those focused on building democratic resilience. As Daniel Steed argued in a recent report from the American Enterprise Institute, and I'll finish with his words, Tocqueville would be hard-pressed to regard these entities as associations forming democratic citizens. Rather, he would see them as vendors and appendages of the government that inexorably finds themselves beholden to their paymasters.
Thank you. Well, one thing you can count on is we don't ask people to all have the same view, which makes for a healthy discussion. And I take a key point from that being, as citizens, we need to step up to create democracy ourselves. And one of the questions I'll come back to is, how do we do that? But Sabreena, over to you.
Okay, so I want to focus on what this era is demanding of us, which is a renewed and strategic investment to investing in the vital work of civil society organizations that foster social cohesion, enhance public trust, they inform citizens, and they also invigorate their participation. So Bill and I are aligned on this, but we're going to be misaligned on something coming up a bit later, but that's okay. And this investment really matters because international evidence has shown that when we support civil society organizations, it's a really important protection from democratic backsliding. And we're in a period of global democratic backsliding right now, so this is particularly relevant for Canada. So I'm going to walk us through 3 different issues that we're facing in our democracy right now, and I'm going to relate them to things that philanthropy could do to make a meaningful difference. So my first issue is about having an informed citizenry. So right now we have information manipulation eroding our sense of a shared reality in Canada. It's also eroding our sense of a common identity in this country. And part of the problem here is that we don't have a strong infrastructure to ensure that Canadians can evaluate good information from bad and identify foreign interference. We can take cues from countries that are fellow middle powers like Estonia and Finland that have prioritized civic education across generations as a form of national defense. And this is to protect their citizens from disinformation campaigns coming from Russia. So their priority in those countries has been to secure a digitally literate, critical thinking population. And they are now seeing the benefits of that investment. Those are citizens that are the most resistant to disinformation in the European Union. That's something we can look at adapting for our multicultural context. And it can't come fast enough because right now civic education in Canada is under-resourced, it's piecemeal, and it's uninspiring. And this matters because it is hindering our ability to have evidence-based, healthy conversations across differences. Democracy sector organizations, of which there are not very many, and several of us, including the Samara Centre, have very limited funds from the Government of Canada. But these organizations play a crucial role by producing and disseminating accessible and informed civic education materials for all ages. And these are resources that are responsive to feedback from our community partners, from teachers, from public librarians, and also from professors who use our material in their classrooms. But all of us in that picture are severely constrained by resources. Philanthropic foundations can make an immediate impact here by recognizing the value of those relationships and then also scaling the development and distribution of those civic education materials. This is about putting effective and informed and wanted resources in the hands of educators and community leaders across provinces and territories. So key issue number 2 is platform regulation, and we've seen some progress on this recently with the Government of Canada tabling Bill 34, the Safe Social Media Act. It's an effort to address online harms, and there's a particular focus on young people. We're encouraged to see the move to regulate digital platforms in the public interest, and its success lies in the details, which are forthcoming. Civil society organizations have readily and continue to contribute to countering foreign interference and protecting Canadian sovereignty by producing the evidence that informs these kinds of policy solutions. At the Samara Centre, we have academically trained researchers on our team that produce timely, nonpartisan insights that are aimed at shaping how we adapt our democracy to face these 21st century challenges. We share this work with journalists, with policymakers, with community leaders, and also academic colleagues. Philanthropy can make a difference here by supporting this expertise with multi-year funding that lets us focus on having an impact. When there's a trust-based relationship for us with a foundation, we're able to grow our initiatives in ways that aren't always immediately foreseeable, but can be incredibly significant. So key issue number 3, my last one, is about investing in the revitalization of civic life in Canada. We need an informed and digitally literate citizenry, but they need somewhere to go. We need social infrastructure, accessible spaces where people can come together in community, where they can check disinformation through in-person conversations, where they can connect with their elected official in a local context. So while the understanding that democracy is under threat in Canada has grown over the last 20 years, the resources to support this work remain largely unchanged since 2007. If we want to really address the pressing civic needs of Canadians right now, we need transformational investment in the civil society organizations that are doing the load-bearing work to shore up our democracy. And the number of us in this space is so small. You know, the head count is under 100, possibly under 50. Amanda is the one that has the most accurate numbers on that. And part of the answer for our sector, for our community, lies in advocating for a Canadian Democracy Endowment. The Samara Centre is a collaborator on this. We're in partnership with many other organizations, including New Majority, and Apathy is Boring is a coalition leader here too. So this is something that we are presenting as a permanent, nonpartisan, arm's-length funding mechanism. It's about properly resourcing the evidence-based solutions that are already underway across the country. This is about supporting nonpartisan, non-academic organizations, so not universities. This is about charities and other nonprofits that are already delivering democratic resilience and civic engagement initiatives. This is a time to scale what's working and also be solution-oriented and try new ways of solving these problems. There is a role for philanthropy here in the endowment. It's not just about having government funds. This is an opportunity for philanthropy to advocate for this funding and then also commit to matching resources, because we are also concerned that this funding not be tied to whatever the government of the day is interested in. Philanthropy can help to play a balancing function there. So in closing, this isn't about foundations finding that one perfect solution, that one perfect definition, that silver bullet to solve democracy. That's not going to happen. Instead, we can focus on having a robust civil society that's well-resourced, has a excellent, robust social infrastructure that enables a healthy democratic culture to flourish that benefits us all.
Amanda, you work with youth. You've been encouraging and not only engagement in the electoral process, but more broadly.
Thank you. And
Over to you.
I'm going to start my timer because I'll start talking and then we'll just listen to me have strong opinions for the rest of the night. I cannot wait to debate the endowment. Let's just be a debate.
Me too.
Let's just get up and do a whole debate on it, because I have thoughts, as I'm sure we all do. So I come to this room and to this night with two lenses. As you mentioned, Susan mentioned, I'm the executive director of New Majority, which is a national nonpartisan youth engagement engine. So I'm going to tell you a bit about New Majority, and I'm going to advocate for electoral participation being critical to a healthy democracy, especially when I so often hear about how we have to focus on other elements of democracy that aren't electoral participation. That's how we lose it. And so you hear me advocate for engagement, and then I'm going to tell you a bit about the democracy sector coalition work and the strategy that I've been helping to lead over the last 9 months, which gives you a bit of, hopefully to give you a bit of grounding on where the Canadian democracy sector is and where it isn't right now and its intersection with philanthropy. So for very fast context, New Majority was founded in 2019, and we work to restore public voice for an entire generation of young people who don't feel that the system is listening or acting in their interest. Those who are too overwhelmed by every day to even know an election is happening, those who aren't necessarily vote protesting, but who are unaware an election is happening, who feel disengaged, disenfranchised, or just out of the democratic system, period. We refer to that group or constituents as the unengaged, and we talk to them face to face. So we don't rely on social media because we know the tech-powered algorithms only surface democratic content to people who are already engaged. So that doesn't help us if you're trying to reach the unengaged. If your algorithm, as I often say, is pancakes and puppies, you're not going to see that an election is coming up, especially one that's municipal or provincial. Sometimes they hear about federal elections, but you should know when we're on the ground and talking in community, 50% of the young people we talk to don't know an election is happening. So we have to start there. The ones who are engaged are not our audience. I came to this work after 2 decades of social impact in the women's entrepreneurship space. I worked for a social impact startup and then my own 13,000 square foot co-working and childcare space, which will be relevant at the end of my talk. I believe in impact investing, in coalition-driven philanthropy, and feminist and gender lens funding models. I also genuinely believe that co-creation between philanthropy, government, and civil society is the only way to dismantle the inequality that I described when I started the 1-minute pithy answer. I also believe that we do need to have a focus on redirecting power within the existing systems versus a burn it all down approach, which, like, while satisfying, don't get me wrong, I have been burned too many times and have evolved my thinking on a burn it down versus work from within approach. Through New Majority, democratic participation is learned through practice. It's not only about electoral participation, but it's not about that. Everyone loves to talk about turnout the day after an election, and somehow it's not the focus of the impact during the writ period, when that's the time where we can do something about turnout. Direct engagement is not just a tactic, it is the strategy. Community is the concrete wall of democracy. When young people receive clear logistical support, trusted information, and peer-to-peer encouragement, they participate. It is that simple. Most importantly, participation leads to young people feeling seen by the democratic system, and that first experience builds the civic confidence to open the door to deeper engagement beyond elections. Young people are not disengaged from democracy. They're disengaged from a system that feels stacked against them. We treat democratic participation as something that needs to be experienced through relational organizing, through peer-to-peer canvassing, and through joy-based civic activations that make democracy feel tangible and personal. Onto the coalition. In thinking about how New Majority navigates the boom and bust cycle of elections, our funding, as Sabreena mentioned, can be precarious. It can also be a very short term. And then in the case of, say, a majority federal government, there becomes a sudden lack of urgency and attention elsewhere. So what do? I started asking how an organization like mine can be in service to a reimagined and protected democracy in Canada. We, my colleagues here, can see the fire at the door, but the average young person doesn't have a shared language for what democracy means on the ground. So about 9 months ago, I set out to help philanthropy partners understand who's doing this work in Canada, what our current resources are, what the barriers to collaboration are, and what a social sector strategy might look like. I couldn't do this work alone, to be clear, and I didn't even really want to do it in-house at New Majority. Given the scarcity of resources and my acute awareness that there is competition amongst us, I didn't want my colleagues to feel that any one organization owned the sector or that work. So I brought on 5 co-designers, Robin Prest from SFU Center for Dialogue, John Beebe from the Democratic Engagement Exchange, Samantha Roosh from Apathy is Boring, Niamh Leonard from the Euphrosyne Foundation, and Mason Ducharme from First Nations Governance. And we put together an initial list of 30 organizations to interview about democracy's current state and our North Star. And guess what we found out after those 30 interviews? We did not have a consensus about what democracy is in Canada. Shocking, I'm sure, to this room. And there was a lot of overlapping tensions around what we needed to do together and next. And actually, it was at Samara Center who generously gave us space to hold a full-day retreat to unpack the results that we learned we're going to need to go back out and talk to the adjacent sectors that impact democracy: journalism, information integrity, human rights, digital safety, tech regulation. We recognize that it is more than electoral participation, but in what context? It was clear after that day that democracy doesn't operate like other issues sectors across Canada, like climate or social justice or gender rights. It is more complex. And so we did another 28 interviews throughout the winter, and then we released the full and comprehensive and interactive report in May. It is more than a what we heard report. It's a proposal for how we can work together with philanthropy, with government, domestically and transnationally, nodding to the existing democratic coalitions that we studied and talked to in the EU, the UK, Brazil, and elsewhere. And it names what we know. There are not enough resources, but there is a strong willingness to collaborate with real momentum to move, which for an underfunded and very short horizon project was a lot to accomplish. I just want to nod to. Finally, I'm just going to end with, when I took over New Majority in 2023, it was my first directive to bring joy back into participation. I wanted dogs. So we established Dogs for Democracy, and during the Calgary municipal elections, we partnered with PALS, Therapy Dogs on Campus. Students came for the puppies, and my canvassers were there to ask, do you know that there is an election happening municipally in the next few weeks? Can I help you make a plan to vote? It was a coalition effort between the university, civil society, philanthropy who helped us get there, and my local colleagues who came for the puppies, all in the same room for the same reason. Since then, we've done Drag for Democracy, Drip for Democracy, Dungeons and Dragons for Democracy. We've partnered with the Toronto Public Library, Calgary Public Library, the YMCA in Moncton. No effort is in isolation. We operate together, separately, but in joy and in community, because hope. Thank you.
And Holly, you get to round us out in this first part of the conversation.
I have to follow Dogs for Democracy. Like, I don't know. And you may have cracked the code with getting young people to give. I don't know. We'll chat.
We'll talk.
So, man, you guys have really got me thinking, and I'm going to try and remember what I was going to say before I heard all of your excellent points. The tension between democracy and philanthropy. I am fascinated by this, as I mentioned off the top. Philanthropy it tends to concentrate power. It certainly concentrates resources, but sometimes for the good of the many, but it is decided by the few. Whereas democracy, again, zooming out, it's not all about the electoral process, but it is about everyone having a say, or certainly the opportunity to impact issues and challenges that affect them. And that's just not how philanthropy works. But despite this, philanthropy can absolutely strengthen democracy, and my co-panelists have done a great job of highlighting examples, real Canadian examples of philanthropy supporting democracy and institutions that protect it. But if we zoom out just a little bit, I'll invite us all to just take a step back and consider philanthropy and its place in creating the environment for democracy to thrive. So as I mentioned, this isn't tied to a certain cause. It's not even tied to organizations who work solely or primarily on protecting democracy, but it's those adjacent ones that you mentioned, justice, journalism, social supports, healthcare. There's an argument, perhaps for a different panel, that if democracy was working at its fullest and most potential, that philanthropy would not be necessary. But we're not there. We may be closer than some of our neighbors, but we're far away from it. So I'm thinking just about how many organizations are doing democratic work and they're not naming it. And as I sit beside Amanda, who is naming a lot of the issues that we're seeing with young people, I can't help but draw the parallels between getting people out to the polls and getting people involved in philanthropy. And I think it might not be as exciting or rhyme as well as Dogs for Democracy, but there's something there for getting young people involved through philanthropy in democracy. And if we zoom out one more time and consider the great wealth transfer that's underway, your new majority is philanthropy's new majority too. And we need to speak to this new majority in a way that makes sense to them. And I think part of that is highlighting and naming the issues that we're seeing with democracy and backsliding, because that matters to a lot of people that aren't donating money. And that might be a way to see some of that money get donated, particularly when we have 14 billion tied up in DAFs. Did I hear that correctly? Yeah, so there's some work to do here, and I think there's some parallels between both worlds, and certainly opportunities for them to intersect in a meaningful way. So I suppose that is what I would contribute at this time, but I want to talk about the endowment now.
Yeah. I'm going to come to that. I'm worried about fisticuffs and that a little bit. But I want to start somewhere else, which is I like to think of philanthropy as the act of citizenship. By that I don't mean belonging to a country, but belonging to a community. And it's how we build strong, vibrant, and inclusive communities. And so far you talked about the need for resources and the need for electoral participation. But if we're going to build community in that way, we need people to act, to get involved. And you certainly alluded to that. The American sociologist Theda Skocpol said that what's wrong with civil society organizations these days, they become too professionalized. They don't have memberships. Board governance it's hard to recruit. So we've talked about civic education and resources, but how do we get people more involved? And I know that's at the core of what you're doing, but can you give us some more guidance as to how do we actually translate those good intentions into on the ground, I belong to, I participate in, I act? Who wants to start that one?
Okay, I can start that. So I want to pick up on the understanding across the panel here that a healthy democracy is more than just voting in an election. It's more than running in an election. But then when we see voter turnout being so low, it makes us all feel bad, and then citizens feel shamed, and we're using this wrong metric to make sense of how healthy our democracy actually is. If you ask citizens, because the other thing that's underpinning this is a sense of intimidation, feeling that they're not prepared enough. When you ask people, why didn't you vote, they say, well, I didn't feel prepared enough and life got in the way. But if you ask people, have you ever volunteered at your kid's school? Have you ever shoveled someone else's driveway? Did you help someone get groceries during the pandemic? Maybe a little more controversially, did you get vaccinated during the pandemic? If you ask people those types of questions, then their answer is yes. And if we code those things as acts of engaged and responsible citizenship, then the sense of democratic capability one has of themselves is much higher. So did you vote or not? That's kind of like, 1 or 0. So most people feel like a 0. But are you being a decent person in your community? Well, the majority of Canadians are doing that, and they feel enabled. So we haven't done a very good job of helping people understand that they're already doing a very good job, that they are already capable and active citizens. And when we think about the messaging during the pandemic to social distance, we didn't reverse that when we could and say, now just social, just social, please. Yeah, social proximity, please, increase it. And there's been a lot of grief and awkwardness and uncertainty coming out of that we just really haven't addressed as a country, as a society. So it's interesting because one of the most common questions we get through our general inbox is, I'm really worried about Canada's democracy. What can I do to make a difference? And we actually we've been thinking about how to do this, like come to our events or go to stuff at the library, or what should people do? And then we realized people actually just need a little bit of structure and guidance to come together and to just learn how to be together in person again. And so one way we did that was, we know how to have book clubs. A lot of people know how to have book clubs. You all read the book in advance. You have a couple of questions, but really it's not about the book. You're coming together. It doesn't matter where it is. It can be a cafe. It can be at someone's house, whatever. So we just made a podcast listening party guide for one of our podcasts. And we called it a listening party because that sounds fun. And there's only 3 questions or so. And if you don't want to use them for our podcast, you can use them for another one. And you just listen to an episode in advance. And then you go off and get some people together and see where that takes you. So I think, Susan, your point about, well, how do we get people back together again and not fighting? We should not rely on voter turnout as our only metric to understand who we are in our democracy. We should not only rely on polling data that asks us if we're polarized to understand who we are and how we relate to each other, because the answer will always be that we're polarized, because that's the only question that gets coverage in media. Like, it's just unfortunate. So we're using the wrong metrics. Let's tell some more positive stories about who and what we are as Canadians. Let's have opportunities where people can come together, enjoy, and just low stakes connection. And then also let's ensure that civil society is supported. So there's free programs at public libraries for kids to go to after school. Where are kids supposed to go to right now, right? Like, where are they supposed to be? Where is their civic onboarding being seen to after having no public school for 2 years during the pandemic? So there's a lot that we're not starting from scratch. And I think if we change the story that we're telling about our democracy, then it will help our confidence, and it will help us be more ambitious about where we're going next.
You agree? Amanda?
I absolutely agree. Voting is a gateway. And we talk about voting as a gateway to democratic participation and civic engagement. And one of the conversations we have on my team, who are all young people, all the time is like, voting to what end, right? What are we doing to invite young people into a system that doesn't serve them? So when I think about how do you get people more engaged, we are thinking about top down and bottom up, that we can't just drive turnout into a system of policy of elected officials who aren't listening to the young people we just told we really want to hear from. So we have to also think about, well, who is representing us? How are these democratic systems at play? Is it truly democratic, or do we have power and forces that actually are much more opaque? And then if that's the case, then are we genuinely and honestly and transparently driving participation into a system that will ultimately disappoint? So we have to do both. We have to encourage people, because without it, politicians have no incentive to make that change. So it's this sort of like upside down, twisty infinity signal we talk about all the time of like, well, yeah, they're not going to change if they don't hear from young people, but what's the motivation for a young person to vote? So I also think about it in terms of short and long term. Short term, let's get participation from all underrepresented groups to the polls, to throw it down on the tables of politicians and say, yeah, hi, we have a constituency, and if you'd like to keep your job, we'd like you to listen. At the same time, we know that's not the only power tool at play, and we need to look at the forces that will take a long time and decades to change in order to have young people want to then continue to participate long term, which isn't necessarily an answer. I also think the fast way in short term is to not really talk about the motivations for why somebody should vote, for this exact reason Sabreena mentioned around, well, I'm busy, I'm overwhelmed, I didn't know who, I don't even know if I want to participate. We find a great way to kind of cut all of that is just say, make a plan to vote, let's go with your neighbors, let's make it a social activity, just vote. If for no other reason, the antidote to anxiety is action. So if you personally would like a little dopamine hit and feel like you have a little bit of control in your day when you have no control on all of these big systemic and scary issues, how about you just come with me and vote? You'll feel better. We'll figure out the rest later. It's effective.
I still want to push another end of this. Sorry, Holly. Which is that one of the ways in which we learn the skills of citizenship is we debate, we take collective action, we make collective decisions. And that happens when you sit on a board, or when you're a member, you go to the AGM, or you just have conversations that are collective decisions that have to lead to some kind of action. And it's really hard to recruit board members these days. Memberships are dwindling. Where does that piece fit in? I mean, how do we, the action of voting, I understand, the action of socializing, but the sort of the harder stuff, because it's an even deeper and longer term commitment where you sign up for a board not for a couple weeks, but for a year or more. I'm looking at you, Bill.
Oh, I wonder, Susan, if organizations are asking the right people to be on their boards, or if they're going back to the same people all of the time, and wanting people from often from the corporate world, or who they think will have ties to help them in their fundraising, and maybe not reaching out to others and making it accessible and feel open to them to participate in the ways you're talking about. Because, I mean, you mentioned Scotch Pole and sort of in this vein, but it also, in the earlier conversation, makes me think of others like Bob Putnam and sort of bowling alone, right? That we're becoming more isolated and not participating in groups. And I'm just going to take a little bit of a tangent to put in a plug for sport in this way, because of course I teach a course, have in the past, in sport and politics, and I'm writing in that area. And there is an enormous amount of evidence that young people who participate in sport benefit in so many ways, as does the local community if there's an infused and vibrant sporting culture and organization. So personally, I was very pleased to see the government in its last financial statement pledged, I think it's $700 million to our national sports organizations, with a good amount of that focused on the grassroots level.
Holly, I cut you off earlier. I apologize.
Yeah, I was thinking a little bit about what Sabreena was saying, and I'm sorry to be so philanthropy focused, but when you were talking about, did you vote, didn't you vote, yes or no, and people start to feel, like disappointed in themselves, it's the same kind of question we ask, or we tend to ask, which I think we should reframe with philanthropy, is, have you made a gift? And philanthropy, as we've come to understand it in the West, is very focused on making donations, but the idea of philanthropy really is more than that. Have you ever volunteered with an organization? Have you ever advocated for a cause that is important to you? Have you ever, sold lemonade and donated the proceeds to the Humane Society? All of these acts are philanthropic in nature and not always considered. So I was just thinking, when you were saying the yes or no, or 0 of 1, that can also apply to philanthropy, and maybe that's part of why people aren't engaged. And we're talking now about boards, and there's a lot of change happening and expectations about board members and governance and structures and power and all of these things, and maybe we need to be making it more accessible to people, or have people understand that maybe they're already participating. Maybe they would be great board members because they sold lemonade and donated to the funds to the Humane Society. Like, I think, need to just reframe how we understand some of these concepts and the success of some of these concepts.
Well, and I think with board membership or with philanthropy, identifying as someone who would participate in that kind of way, I think there might be hesitation or reluctance for people who don't have generational knowledge of how to do that.
Or wealth.
Or wealth.
Yeah.
And philanthropy, certainly, that term has a lot of weight to it of, you must have to have this amount of money for this many generations, and have done it in this kind of way. And when we think about this new generation of philanthropists or potential philanthropists, they want to serve, but they want to serve in a contemporary manner, and probably need some guidance and support on what that would look like. And I know, there are, like the Toronto Foundation, for instance, has a program that helps people solidify that as a new identity and find ways to give that align with their values. And counts as philanthropy, but it doesn't mean, you have to have been a Carnegie or something.
And part of what we try to do through this program is kind of reclaim the language of philanthropy in a more positive way. When it comes to the role of foundations, because foundations are certainly thinking about their responsibility and role in this in much deeper and wider ways. And you talked about foundations possibly providing resources. What else do they need to do? Or how do they need to provide resources? What should we be asking of the foundations who are now very interested, many of them, in this sector?
Me?
Whoever wants to take it on.
And when you say foundations, do you mean organizations generally or specific foundations that are doing democratic work?
I mean foundations more broadly. Some of them have signaled an interest, some of them are and wondering if they should, and some of them aren't in that space yet.
Aren't it yet? Yeah, I think that foundations are very, very interesting in the philanthropic landscape in Canada because often they are very hyper-focused on a problem and solving a specific problem. Individuals driven by experience, emotion, corporate giving is driven by all other sorts of values, and foundations, speaking generally, are really trying to solve an issue. And I think in my experience working with foundations, though I haven't always been successful in actually getting the funds using this approach, but is shifting the understanding of some of these things. So I said at the beginning, maybe a lot of organizations are doing work in democracy and they're not naming that. I don't know how many people in here work in revenue generation or cases for support or fundraising, but I would venture a guess that a lot of you that don't have the word democracy in your cases for support. And sometimes when I'm working with organizations or foundations, they don't quite know what they don't know yet, and helping highlight the work of organizations through different cause areas, highlighting the democratic angle, I think is actually really helpful, because a lot of these foundations, that is the problem that they're trying to solve. It's, we hear healthy communities in a lot of grant applications, or strengthening of civil society in a lot of grant applications, and that's not necessarily within the case for support for the organizations doing the work. So I think part of it is just shifting a little bit and helping foundations that are very narrow and very focused on one thing understand that that one thing might be influenced by other organizations and causes that they haven't yet thought about.
And I should expand that question. It might be individual philanthropists too. We're trying to think of how do I get in. Yes, Amanda.
Yeah, so I can add some insight in how we talked to a number of foundations for the Democracy Coalition study. And I agree with Bill, not to get it, we're going to inch towards the endowment debate. But one of the tensions that has come up and continues to come up is around the objectives of foundations and their funding outcomes. You know, they're looking towards problems and solving issues, and sometimes there's a perception of partisanship. Or, you know, some organizations are focused on issues that are deemed progressive, which can alienate right-of-center foundations. How do we then cultivate an environment where we're talking about boosting funding for democracy? Do we mean protecting democracy, or do we mean issues that are connected to democracy or dependent on a healthy democracy in order to do their work? And I can tell you, having been through 58 interviews, there is not consensus. And in fact, this is a core tension between what we're asking of philanthropy, of government, and organizations like Sabreena and mine, who I'd say we identify as a democracy organization, where we have democracy in our mandate, and it requires us to be nonpartisan. And it's difficult. It's difficult to have these conversations because we need to bring human rights into the democratic conversation and funding. We need to bring journalism. We also need to bring Indigenous communities, and we need to bring right-of-center and conservative foundations in and corporations. And so what positions do we take, and how? Like, we don't have this sorted out. Disagreement, conversation, space to disagree, space to center democracy is important. It's not all sorted. what philanthropy can do: write checks, unrestricted, flow funds quickly. We don't have time, it's a fire, it's an emergency. I think sometimes we can get really caught, especially in the case of democracy, in building a strategy. And it can be difficult, I will tell you, for organizations like mine that are resource strapped, to hear about numerous foundations that are pausing funding for the next year to reevaluate their strategy and go and find new board members to think about how they can enter the democracy space. We don't have time. Write checks. We'll sort it out once we get on the other side.
So the Samara Center is primarily funded through family foundations and other foundations. And it's been really interesting to observe what this landscape looks like and how they approach managing a relationship with us. And, you know, the term democracy can feel grassroots. It can be about, people power, but it can also feel intellectual and scholarly and very fancy. And one thing I've observed is sometimes there are foundations that really get tied into enjoying the academic intellectual exercise of it all. And then they get focused on trying to answer questions that we actually already have answers to through the research. And just because you're passionate about an area doesn't mean you have to become an expert on it and then just commission work that could, that uses up resources that could go towards actual meaningful impact. And it's very ironic because an aversion to expertise is kind of an authoritarian way to handle yourself. So that's just been like one of my observations in this role. And also I wonder how much, like I kind of get a sense from Amanda of how often they talk to each other, these foundations, but about their operations. And what I've kind of come to understand is this economy of foundations and how many jobs are involved with giving money away or not giving it away. And then that creates a circumstance sometimes where there's a connection between requiring more material for your proposal, for your application, for your reporting, is in their view tied to how important this matter is. And that is incredibly onerous for small teams like ours. We have under 10 people working at the Samara Center and only 5 of us are full-time salaried staff. So if our whole purpose is to just generate just material for material's sake, that's really ridiculous. And I don't think they know that. And then, we have to be selective in how we maintain and grow the relationships with the funders who truly want to have a trust-based partnership with us, where they are interested in actually getting to know us, actually getting to know our material, and then just saying, like, here's the money, go for it. I don't think people realize in the foundation world that there can be an instance where 2 foundations are asking for the same amount of material. This has happened to me. One is saying you can have it for $50,000 over 2 years if you provide this much material. And the other foundation said, with that amount of material, they didn't know this about each other, but same amount of material. You can get $50,000 over 2 years here, or $500,000 for 2 years here. So I'm gonna go here, and I'm gonna build that relationship, and I wanna see where that goes. And then this other one that wants to feel fancy and important, well, I don't know where they're gonna give their money, but like, I don't want it until it's gonna work for us. Because I have to make decisions that are in the best interest of my mission, my organization, and I have to do right by my board. And I told them this story. So I don't think these foundations understand that they can be missing opportunities, if I may say, to fund excellent work, because their process of granting is absurd and completely out of line with where we are as a sector right now.
I think you're bringing up a great question I continue to ask, which is, who's setting the strategy, philanthropy or civil society? And I opened my remarks with, like, I do believe it needs to be co-created. I really do think the best way through is co-creation between philanthropy, foundations, the public, individual donors, and civil society. But I think also philanthropy shouldn't set the strategy. And right now, that's the case. Right now, we say, how do we mission, align our work and put the right words in the application so that we can get the dollars because it's limited and we need to align as fast. The civil society experts know. Academia has told us and informed us. We know what the problems are. We know how to do the work. And I think when we recognize what role each of us have to play, we get there faster.
Okay, let's take on the big question about what's government role in this. Bill, you said you'd be provocative. You made one.
Bill,
Scared to
we're going to pile on.
Just remind us
And another thing.
briefly why there shouldn't be, government shouldn't be part of this.
Well, I think it's a little nuanced because when I hear, discussion about, I like the discussion of partnerships with public libraries and YM and YWCAs and those sorts of things. I think there's a role for journalism for government to fund and encourage grassroots, participatory, small d, democratic activities for sure. Where I have problems is the funding, thinking of government as the source of funding for organizations that have as sort of their raison d'etre democratic watchdogs or democratic reform organizations, even things like organizations that would want to have as their focus increasing voter turnout. I'm not sure that should be a project of government. And we can remember in recent elections the controversy around Elections Canada, thinking that maybe it had a mandate to try to increase turnout and did some advertising that became very controversial. It was seen as outside of the purview of a government agency. So I think my view is that while the work is very important, we should look to civil society and philanthropy to fund that kind of organization.
And on the other side, we heard about how scarce resources are. So, Sabreena, Amanda, Holly, you made these cases.
I don't subscribe to many binaries in my life, in my queer life, in my work life, and I don't believe that we don't live in a binary between government and philanthropy as it is. They are intermingled. So, a short story with Elections Canada. New Majority had never had money from the government when I took over, but I walked in the door and I said, we need Elections Canada funding right now. And walked in, we got $20,000 from Elections Canada to work the federal election, but that $20,000 unlocked $2 million of philanthropy money. Why? Because without Elections Canada, philanthropy is risk averse. Who are you? What are you really doing? Why are you working elections? Who are you talking to? The minute I said I have Elections Canada funding, the fifth largest family foundation in this country wrote a very large check. Because that's the reality of a system that relies on a mix of government and philanthropy. So where I agree with you, William, is that organizations and associations that need to criticize and protect democracy, in the coalition report, we make a case for a democracy coalition. We're moving towards a network, very similar to Pacto per Democracy in Brazil. The EU has some democracy coalition works. An organization that comes together to write op-eds, to speak out against democratic backsliding, shouldn't have government funding. There's a conflict there. However, when we did a scan, it's like philanthropy's funding about $15 to $20 million to democracy organizations a year. That's best case. There are well over 50 organizations. There are 100 in the Atlas who rely on democracy, and I know we didn't include everyone. Philanthropy can't support the fire that we have, so I wish it was different. It's not. So we do need a mix. I think it's both. I think we also need to be aware that we're working in Alberta right now. We're having a lot of hard time getting some partners there. There is concern about speaking out on the referendum because of how much government funding flows to the social sector. That's real. Also, are they supposed to turn down government funding and close their doors? Like, I just think you're right, it's nuanced, it's not binary, and the system we currently have needs both.
I see your nuance points too, Bill. Like, I get it. It can't just be only government that is responsible for having a healthy democracy. And there's some activities and entities and organizations that it just would not make sense for them to have government funding. But having a healthy democracy is an issue that affects 100% of our population. So there's a connection there that needs to be addressed. And I think as a sector, our requests and our demands of government and of philanthropy have been paltry because we have been under-resourced and haven't really been in a position to be more strategic because this country was kind of taken by surprise that our democratic culture is as vulnerable as it is. So our efforts behind the Canadian Democracy Endowment are not saying the government should fund 100% of democracy activities in this country. It's that we need to make some sort of request of government, and it's still so modest. I want the number to be much higher.
I do too.
But it sends a powerful signal to philanthropy, to young people, to other potential donors that this work is happening and it matters. And if we don't resource our democratic culture sufficiently, then we really pay a severe price. And how we're really awakening to the fact that, oh, this thing is so important, but we really haven't taken care of it, and we really haven't centered it in terms of Canadian identity and social cohesion and national security. So there's an opportunity there.
I'm going to ask you, the audience, if anyone has questions. I think we have a microphone somewhere, is that right? And if you have any questions for each other. Yes.
Thank you. So my question is...
Please identify yourself too.
Oh, my name is Benson. I'm the second year of MPNL student. And I have a question for everyone. So it's a little long. I would like to ask a question about how we maintain the belief that democracy is inherently good. I completely agree that deterring misinformation is critical. And the citizen education models we see in Finland and Estonia are great examples of how to do that. However, I believe we are also facing a deeper problem. Beyond misinformation, there's a growing disillusionment with the current state of Western democracy. The fundamental assumption that the democratic model is inherently superior is being gradually challenged. At the same time, we see competing non-democratic political systems in other parts of the world producing undeniable results, showing positive trajectories in both human and economic development. So my question is twofold. First, how do we rebuild civic trust and restore resilience in the core values of Western democracy, especially given recent disappointments in leading democratic nations and while non-democratic alternatives are actively delivering competing results? And second, as a graduate student in the Philanthropy and Nonprofit Leadership Program, what role can we play? And how can the Canadian charitable and nonprofit sector actively step up to help restore that civic resilience?
Thank you. Question. Short essay there. Yeah.
Publish that.
Holly?
No, I feel like that's a Bill question.
Love it. Okay, you're on. She punted to you.
The first thing I would say more broadly is I think we have to be very careful when we talk about democratic backsliding, particularly in the Canadian context. I think our over-reliance on American news and thinking about what's happening in the United States sometimes makes us think that the problem exists, but I'm not sure that it's as bad as it might have, we might sometimes assume because of the influence of what's happening with our southern neighbor. I do think the point about education is crucial, and I certainly think that there's a place for government to support civic education in our schools. I remember when my daughter was in grade 10 in Ontario, that's when they have the civics class, right?
And the textbook was awful. When I looked at it, oh, it was. And, you know, I could elaborate on that. But there are a lot of things that could do. And she went to a high school in Ottawa, all of her education in Ottawa, and never once had a trip to Parliament Hill. You know, we see other schools from across the country do that, but, you know, from Ottawa, they weren't doing that as well. So I think there's a real place for that kind of education and funding for community organizations that want to imbue civic education and civic experience to our young people, I think leads to that as well.
I think your point about how well this system hasn't really been working for everybody is very valid. And that reality is why anti-democratic forces have been so successful in terms of spreading mis and disinformation and vitriol on digital platforms, which have been unregulated. So that's created a destination for people who have not felt seen, heard, valued, understood as citizens to have some sort of connection and meaning. But unfortunately, that is not serving productive ends. So if we want to have a democracy that's equipped for the 21st century, we really do have to reckon with the fact that representation and participation has to be addressed head on, and it has to make sense and be rooted in communities that don't trust our democratic institutions and haven't for a long time and have felt ignored. And that's really about our democratic institutions being responsive. We know that elected officials and public servants work very hard, but what have they been doing to demonstrate responsiveness to these concerns? So I think that's a very specific to Canada situation that we should grapple with. And by doing that, and having civic education, by having more local journalism, which has been decimated, and that's another way we don't have any good news stories about what's happening in our local communities, we can look towards having a stronger culture of civic engagement across the country, and one that is strongly tied to seeing to our social cohesion and really making that central to our democratic efforts, that it's not so much about voter turnout at the polls, but how we are relating to one another. And you know, other polling data will show that there is high trust in our institutions and there is high trust in our fellow citizens. So there's a lot of good that we can build on there to just kind of reframe the story so that it's not just this is terrible, let's just make it worse, but that there's room for improvement. How can we have a continuous improvement mindset when it comes to our democracy, and have that be the way we go forward?
I also think
Another question?
Oh, Amanda had an answer, Susan. Yeah.
I just wanted to add that I think when we talk about protecting, you know, or reframing, rebranding democracy, you have to be careful that democracy as a concept, as a word, doesn't get swooped into coding like freedom or woke or labeling it. We can't label democracy a progressive cause. When we do, we become polarized, because then it becomes, are we pro or anti-democracy? Is it a fight on the left versus the right? It's so dangerous, and it's something I think about. It's one of the things that keeps me up at night, is how do we talk about democracy and welcome disagreement without it being, are you pro or against? That's where the divisive populism has risen. And I agree with Sabreena, like the authoritarian rise amongst young people has been for a reason, and to ignore it is at our peril.
There was another question. Yes, you have.
Hi, thank you very much for the insights. My name is Tamriz Khan. I've struggled for many, many years of my career between the distinction between civic space and civil society. And I think it's important to make that distinction, because I see civic space as the community that you've been talking about that actually defines democracy, and civil society as the more institutional aspect of it, which is where philanthropy comes in terms of systems and funding and the money. But I'm just wondering, if you're trying to make a connection between democracy and philanthropy, this distinction between civic space, where I think democracy actually lies, but where philanthropy is sort of disconnected from, and civil society, the institutional space, that at times is also disconnected from civic space and community. how do you think we can actually bring those two together for actually civic space to be the real space where democracy exists without conflating it with the institutional space as in organizations? Thank you.
That's a great question. Good question.
Go. Do you want to go?
I don't.
Go ahead.
That's a Holly question.
Yeah, I'm thinking about philanthropy in kind of both spaces, certainly. And again, I want to be clear. When I'm saying philanthropy, I'm talking about the westernized understanding of philanthropy and giving away money, because this space in the community is very, very tied to philanthropy and volunteerism and involvement and the more systemized elements of civil society, which you tied to, did you tie to philanthropy? Yeah, an institution. I don't only understand philanthropy to be institutional, I guess is what I'm saying. So when I think about philanthropy, I think about all the work that's happening that is not giving money away. And that to me is, as you're saying, more of the democratically rooted work that's happening in communities. It's not necessarily giving away money, it's advocacy, it's volunteerism, it's being involved in these spaces that where democracy can thrive. So I don't actually have an answer in terms of the systemic stuff. I just think about philanthropy as being more of a broad concept that is disconnected from money.
I was very anti-democratic in this because I didn't leave you enough time for questions. I didn't leave enough time for you to ask questions of each other, and we'll have to do that at the reception. But as we close, sort of a minute of what should we take away? We started with the question, what's the relationship between philanthropy and democracy? What do you want us to take away? Amanda, I'm going to start with you.
I loved how little this conversation was about politics. And I would love for more conversations about democracy and democratic systems to not enter the world of politics. And I think that's hard for people who are unengaged to separate the two. But it's important that they be separate.
Bill.
When we think of democratic backsliding, I want to just put on the table something that's happening in Alberta at the moment that's not the referendum on separatism. And this is a move by the government and the premier to make boundary drawing a partisan activity. So they've rejected the report from the Independent Commission. Canada has long been seen around the world as a model in terms of how to do this in a nonpartisan way. And we only have to look to our southern neighbors to see the impact of partisan district drawing on democracy writ large and how it affects and has its tentacles through every part of the democratic practice.
Holly.
I wish we had a little bit more time to dig into what you were describing, which is really trust-based philanthropy, and how that is kind of, in my view, the most democratic way to practice philanthropy, as particularly giving money away. I think that we've come a long way, certainly in the last 5 to 10 years, about centering trust-based philanthropy and just writing those checks and letting you guys go to work and do the good work that really, it's not the philanthropists that are going to understand the best, even though they might be the ones writing the checks. So I think it's not all about kind of the democratization of philanthropy. Great work happens when someone just decides to write a check without checking with anyone around them. And I think there's space for that. But this trust-based philanthropy that really I think is going to be the key to connecting the two concepts. I wish we had more time to chat about that.
Sabreena, last word to you.
Thank you, Susan. Anti-democratic forces are extremely well resourced. So foundations and philanthropy more broadly needs to ask themselves right now, how do anti-democratic forces operate and then commit to matching that vigor?
Well said. Thank you all. This has been a great conversation. And have a reception outside where you can ask questions, comments of each other and our panelists. Again, thank you all.
Thank you.